Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Well, it is good to be back. I have returned from the East Coast. Unfortunately, I will probably have to go back in the not too distant future, possibly a few weeks. Very, very regrettable situation that I am currently dealing with. But nonetheless, we will continue on. We will continue to make content. And I apologize for the lapse in content. Again, difficult situation. And with that difficult situation, it tends to be more difficult to create content and or find the motivation to create content. So for those of you who are bearing with us, I greatly appreciate it. And we are going to make every attempt to become, again, more regular in terms of content production. Maybe not every day, but definitely the goal will be at least every other day, if not every day. Maybe even multiple times a day, but we'll see. We'll see how things go. So we're continuing our coverage on the war between the Russian Federation, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and its Ukrainian proxy forces. Now, as we continue to look at the map of what is happening, the Russians continue this high-tempo, very aggressive war of attrition centered on air power, air capability, long-range cruise missiles, massive amounts of drones. In the last few weeks, we have seen the Russians launch quite literally thousands of drones at various Ukrainian targets. Now, the drones that the Russians are using, we often mistakenly call these Iranian-produced or Iranian drones of Iranian origin. Now, initially, that capability was Iranian. The drones that the Russians are using now are much more advanced and capable than what the Iranians are capable of producing. And not only that, the Russians are now producing these systems on a scale that is just massive. And again, that is part and a component of this ongoing war of attrition, not to mention the Iskanders, the long-range cruise missiles, and the other systems that the Russians, both open source and non-open source, that the Russians are using against the Ukrainians. And as we look at the map here, we can see, let's go over to the deep state map. Again, this is a Ukrainian mapping system, a Ukrainian supported mapping service that looks at territory gained by the Russians and or lost by the Russians and or the Ukrainians day by day. And if we look at the Pokrovsk sector of operations, the high-intensity offensive operations that are occurring in the Donbass, let's back it up where you, the viewer, can see what is going on. You can clearly see this is not a stagnant operation. While it's not a war of maneuver, again, the whole purpose of this, and we're going to go back to the first, and then we'll just fast forward, and we'll kind of look at this sector running from south of Pokrovsk to the northeast of Pokrovsk, and then watch what has happened just this month. And it's just relentless what is happening in terms of this ongoing Russian operation. Not only that, we're seeing a massing of Russian troops in the Sumy sector as well. Now, it is believed that the Russians have between 50,000 and 60,000+ forces that were committed originally to operations in Belgorod and Kursk, in the Sunflower fiasco that the Ukrainian military launched into the Russian Kursk Oblast. The Russians have since pushed those Ukrainian forces out of these potato fields, out of these sunflower fields, and are now launching offensive operations into Ukraine within the area of Sumy. And again, it is being reported that the Russians are marshaling forces in this area for a possible move to crack the defensive lines near Sumy. So we're going to continue to pay close attention to what is happening in this area and the continued amassing of Russian forces. You have the 51st Guards Airborne Regiment of the 106th Guards Airborne Division, the 83rd Separate Guards Air Assault Brigade, another element of the 106th Guards Airborne, the 56th Air Assault Regiment, 76th Airborne Division, that's the Pskov Division, the 155th Separate Brigade of Marines, again another 76th element, the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade, and the 177th Separate Regiment of Marines, 11th Air Assault Brigade, 64th Separate Motorized Rifle Brigade, 38th Motorized Rifle Brigade, 71st Guards Motorized Rifle Regiment, and then major elements of the 7th Airborne Assault Division as well. So a very capable component of the Russian armed forces, some of the more proficient, more elite, both light infantry and motorized rifle formations of the Russian army massing near Sumy. Now, will this become a war of maneuver? Will we see the Ukrainian military start to break apart in the coming weeks and days, especially as Russia picks up the tempo of operation? And again, that is very, very likely. Again, as we look at reports that are coming in from areas around the Ukraine, around major Ukrainian cities, smaller Ukrainian towns, mid-sized Ukrainian cities, the recruitment effort by the Ukrainian military is lagging. It is having serious challenges in finding volunteers and or conscripting non-volunteers, in which many cases we are seeing these forces pressed into service through the use of physical force, meaning they are actively, the Ukrainian police and security forces, are essentially arresting Ukrainian males and then pressing them into military service. And this has been an ongoing issue. The Ukrainian ability to recruit forces, recruit manpower, is far below what we are seeing in terms of the capability from the Russians. The Russians, essentially, every 30 days, can field essentially a core-sized element of about 30 to 35,000 troops that are joining the military every month. 300,000 troops every 10 months. And again, that is far beyond, that is essentially between 6 and 8 times more forces than what the Ukrainians are able to field in terms of their recruitment efforts. And it's not really a recruitment effort at times, it is a conscription effort, a forced conscription effort. So that is the telltale signs that things are really starting to break apart for Ukrainian forces in this ongoing conflict. And compounding that, the Russians have been very successful over the last 30 days in terms of being able to hit Ukrainian depots, command and control centers, training facilities. So these forces that are being pressed into service are being attacked even before they are moved to frontline positions. And again, the desertion, the AWOL, what is happening with the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian army, it is simply not sustainable at this point for a Ukrainian military to continue to offer the kind of resistance that it has offered in the past. Now, the Western militaries, the militaries of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Poland, the intelligence efforts of the United States is what is keeping the Ukrainian proxy force in this fight. If the United States were to quit intel sharing with the Ukrainians, this war would probably end within weeks, if not months. It would be incredibly dire for the Ukrainians if that intel effort was stopped in terms of U.S. sharing. Now, in terms of future-facing peace deals, interesting article that came up. Trump envoy, U.S. open to freeze NATO expansion to help Russia-Ukraine war, to help end the Russia, quote-unquote, Ukraine war. Now look, NATO can't really expand any further. What does that mean? What does it mean by ending NATO expansion? Well, the only place that NATO could, in theory, expand would be the Ukraine. It would be Moldova. It would be Georgia. Now, the problem with this is that doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter for the Russians. The Russian view is that NATO has already expanded too far. Remember, as we went into this conflict back in 2022, during the early days just prior to this conflict, Russia was demanding the limiting of NATO forces, especially in the Baltic nation states and Poland. If we go back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had the Soviet Union, and you had the Warsaw Pact allied forces. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary. Remember, the Baltic states were part of the Soviet Union. Part of the Soviet Union. I am not certain, as Russia recovers and we look towards the future, that Russia is going to accept the Baltic states to be part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Why is that? Well, you have to look at the activity of these Baltic states. You have to look at the activity of Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and how it responded and then asserted itself in this war between Russia and the Ukraine. If the Baltic states would have minded their own business, remember, look, the Ukraine is not part of NATO. There was no obligation for 3 very small states that are essentially non-tenable defensively. The ability of Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania to defend itself, and the ability of NATO proper, the main NATO states, the United Kingdom, the United States, Germany, France, to come to the aid of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania in the event of an armed conflict is something that NATO would not be able to do in terms of coming to the aid and the defense of the Baltic states. But nonetheless, these Baltic states decided to intervene on the behalf of Ukraine. Remember, they are not obligated per treaty. They're not obligated. They have asserted themselves in this conflict. And it's very short-sighted. What do I mean by that? Well, think of it this way. If Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia had not asserted itself, injected itself into this conflict, would the Russians pay much attention to the Baltics? Probably not. The Baltic states are positioning themselves as a threat to a much larger, much powerful nation state that it does not have the ability to defend itself against without the massive support of the West, without the massive support of the United States. But again, I don't believe the United States, the United Kingdom, is going to sacrifice its men and women in an attempt to defend three states that are indefensible. It would take, essentially, World War III mass mobilization to retake the Baltic states if the Russians took control of those three states. And again, my contention is that most European powers would not want to sacrifice their sons and daughters on a scale not seen since World War II to retake the Baltic states. So mistake number one was bringing the Baltic states into NATO. Mistake number two, and this was the massive mistake, the biggest mistake of all, was these Baltic states inserting themselves into this conflict. Again, the Russian, NATO, Ukrainian conflict. They have placed a bullseye on themselves by doing this. Again, very short-sighted. Right now, the Baltic states believe that because Russian forces are tied down against the Ukrainians, that there's no real threat, that NATO would immediately come, support Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and protect those states from a Russian military operation. Maybe. But what happens after? What happens after the Russian victory in the Ukraine? What happens to that 700,000 Russian force construct that is no longer being utilized in the Ukraine? Where will it reposition? Is it possible that that force could be moved into Belarus and the borders of Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania? And then how long would the Baltic states last if that 700,000 force juggernaut were to cross the border probably not long. And again, the Baltic states put the bullseye on themselves. What should have happened? Well, number one, NATO should have never allowed the Baltic states into NATO. I think at this point it's probably safe to say that NATO should not have expanded into Poland. There could have been defense treaties, and the Poles could have been given the opportunity to defend themselves by increasing their own military capacity and creating localized military alliances, possibly. But again, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, after the fall of the Warsaw Pact, was it necessary? Again, short-term gain. Hey, great, we can move NATO into Poland. We can move NATO into the Baltic states. We can move NATO into Romania. And at the time, given Russian capability and military capacity, it wasn't really an issue. But again, this is that short-sighted thinking. This is a very short-sighted strategy that eventually the Russian Federation will repair itself. The Russian Federation will rearm. And that is exactly what is going to happen after the Ukrainian conflict. The Russian military, in all probability, is going to be about 3 times the size and capability of the force that existed when the Ukrainian-Russia war started. And that force and that leadership in the Kremlin is going to be looking at the Baltic states and saying, okay, we allowed you to join NATO. We didn't like it, but we didn't stop it. But now, in all probability, the Russians are going to reevaluate that. And they're going to ask themselves, is this a long-term proposition that we can live with over the course of the next 50 years? And the answer to that is probably not. And that probably not is the result of the Baltic states' activity in terms of its support for adversarial forces in the Ukraine against the Russian Federation. The rooster is going to return. And the question is when that is going to happen? Well, probably after the end of the Ukrainian war. Look, if I was Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, again, rethink what is happening in the now in terms of its position of supporting the Ukrainians and its antagonistic relationship with the Russian Federation. The Russians are going to remember this. And eventually, there's going to be a price to pay. And again, will the sons and daughters of the United States be sent to fight in the Arctic conditions of the Baltic to defend the Baltic states? Probably not. That war would be greatly unpopular and probably, in all probability, cause World War III. Well, look, it has been great. More to come. As always, thank you for joining us. More to come. Good day.